Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread. Today, we are welcoming back someone whose work has profoundly shaped how the addiction and recovery field understands healing, hope, and human change. There are moments in this work that still stop me in my tracks, and sitting down with Dr. John Kelly really felt like one of those rare full circle experiences, the kind where you're talking with someone whose research has quietly shaped how you think, how you practice, and how you keep hope alive as a clinician. He's genuinely one of my heroes in this field. And what I love about what I get to do is this. I get to connect with people who inspire us, people who expand our way of thinking about addiction and recovery, people who help us remember why we chose this path in the first place. Conversations like this don't just teach us something new, they really reconnect us to our purpose. Dr. John Kelly is the founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute. It's a leading nonprofit research institute affiliated with Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kelly is one of the most respected voices in addiction science today, having published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers and helped reshape the way we talk about recovery, stigma, and treatment outcomes. The Recovery Research Institute was created with a simple but powerful mission to enhance recovery through science. Their work bridges research, education, and public outreach, translating complex addiction science into practical, empowering information for people in recovery, clinicians, families, and communities. And if you've ever wondered whether recovery is really possible, today's conversation may be one of the most hopeful episodes you've listened to all year. We dive into some really big practical questions. How do researchers actually define and measure recovery? Why remission and recovery aren't exactly the same thing, what the science really says about long-term outcomes, and why recovery is far more common than people think. Dr. Kelly shares a multi-dimensional view of recovery that goes far beyond just stopping the behavior. We explore improvements in the quality of life, meaning, identity, community, and psychological well-being. Because recovery, as he describes it, isn't just about removing symptoms. It's about what gets added back into life when healing begins. So if you've ever felt discouraged by the cultural narrative that addiction is this lifelong sentence, this conversation offers something refreshing, evidence-based hope. So whether you're in recovery yourself or supporting someone you love or even working in the field, this conversation reminds us that recovery isn't just about surviving, it's about rebuilding a life that feels worth waking up for. Here's our conversation. All right, we are so excited to have Dr. John Kelly back on the podcast. Thank you for agreeing to come back on our show today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. Well, I just really want to dive in specifically to the Recovery Research Institute and how you guys, how do you actually measure recovery?
Well, you can think about recovery, it's a multidimensional construct, right? We think about different things related to, a problem behavior or substance use disorder. So one dimension of it would be reducing use or exposure or engagement with the behavior. So that could be, lower levels of non-harmful use or abstinence. So that's one dimension of it. Another part of it is remission. So there's another piece of it, which is remission. And that's kind of from the disorder piece of it. Are you in remission from the disorder? In other words, you may actually have some exposure to the substance, but you're not symptomatic. So that would be remission. You could be completely abstinent, but you can be in remission with having some low-level exposure and still be in remission, i.e. not have symptoms of the disorder. And then recovery, you could think of as kind of what's been added to the remission. You can think of remission as what's subtracted from the human organism in terms of symptoms, and then think of recovery as what's added when you remove the exposure to the drug or the poison or the food or the behavior. That what's added in quote unquote recovery would be the good stuff that comes around, the improvements in functioning, the improvements in psychological well-being, in quality of life, the things that people often report who are in recovery. These are the kind of added dimensions.
So then it might be possible for somebody to maybe not be in remission from the substance, but they're feeling a certain level of recovery that maybe they haven't experienced before because their life is improving. They're, able to do things they weren't able to do prior, but maybe they've been able to like reduce the use. So someone could be in remission and also in recovery at the same time, like not in remission, but in recovery at the same time.
That's harder. It's possible, in the outline you just described, you nicely articulated there. It's possible for that to happen. It's less likely. It's more typical the other way around, where people are in remission and then they're in recovery. Now, I'm saying this is not agreed upon universally. There's no clinical or public consensus on what I'm saying, but this is what some people would say. And I think it makes sense. It's logical that you would have these different elements and dimensions of the recovery construct. But essentially, it's kind of a reduction in symptoms or no symptoms, plus added aspects of quality of life. As a result, it's typically as a result, because usually the impairment in quality of life and functioning is directly due to the substance. So you have to remove the substance in order to get into recovery, typically.
The well-being benefits. Absolutely. So what does the research say about people who do recover from substance use disorder? We often hear, maybe even in the media still today, that, addiction is this death sentence and the outlook can feel so grim at times. So what does the research say?
Well, the first thing to note is that when we are talking, it depends what you're talking about. I think when you're talking about substance use disorder more broadly, is a very broad range of drug and alcohol involvement and impairment associated with the complete range of substance use disorder. You can have 2 symptoms and be in the category of a substance use disorder. You can have 11 symptoms and be in the same category. Now, we do have delineations of severity, mild, moderate, and severe along that spectrum of substance involvement and impairment. What we talk about typically when we talk about addiction, that's the severe end of the spectrum. That's actually a minority of all the people who meet criteria in any given year for a substance use disorder. And typically, when we're culturally talking about recovery, we're talking about the more severe end of the spectrum. Now, when you look in the population, in answer to your question with that in mind, what I just said, when you look at the prevalence rates of recovery in the general population of people who meet criteria in any given in their lifetime, have they met criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder, 75% are in remission or recovery from those disorders. So this is a good prognosis disorder when you look across the broad range of substance involvement and impairment. When you look at just the severe range, it's about 60 to 65%. So still 2/3 of people will eventually get into recovery from one of these disorders, even at the more severe end of the spectrum. It may take them more serious attempts to do so, but most will eventually get there.
Yeah, they just need to keep going.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. And it's important to recognize, we did a study from the National Recovery Study, for example, where we asked people we had a nationally representative sample of people who were in recovery from a significant alcohol or drug problem. And the number of serious recovery attempts it took for them to resolve their problem and get into recovery was anywhere between 2 and 5. Okay, so actually the median was 2 serious recovery attempts, okay, across the population. So it's not an endless number. I think we have this, just, to your question, there's a nihilism, there's a kind of a negative kind of valence around and negative, negative pessimistic view of recovery, as you said. But the majority of people do recover. It doesn't take that many serious attempts to recover. Now, on the severe end, it does. It takes a few more, but not endless. People talk about this, impossible chance of getting into recovery, when we know even on the severe end of the spectrum, we're not talking about 10 or 20. We're talking about a median of 5 serious attempts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say clinically, that is exactly what we see is usually, 2 or 3 attempts. And then, it starts to stick.
Yep.
I think with each of those attempts, you build more community, you build more skills, and eventually you just have like a bigger tool belt in order to be able to face life. And you've had enough abstinent days to see like, oh yeah, this is worth fighting for. And it does, like a workout starts to become part of who they are and how they are. And, the substance use seems to be the outlier. It doesn't seem to be what they are seeking as much anymore, where it was before their everyday habitual process.
And I think that's important, isn't it, to communicate to people and families who can lose hope. They maybe are hopeless, they feel hopeless, but to let them know not to give up trying, just like you said, Clarissa, is that people keep trying, pick yourself up, keep moving forwards, build on the skills you've already developed, the experience you have, because, remission and recovery is not that far off for most people.
I love that hopeful messaging. And I mean, it's something we really try to spread here, because it's not this, death sentence. It may mean you have to work a little harder and have some self-binding strategies in place, but you can have a big, beautiful life in recovery, and that is possible.
That's right. Exactly right.
So can you speak to us? I know you did a study on what the active ingredients in recovery are that you found among people who, were doing well. Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's been a number of, actually, we've done some studies ourselves. There's been a great deal of effort expended looking at the active ingredients in recovery across not only addiction, but also mental health. And there was a big study that was conducted by a woman named Mary Leamy, and she looked at a couple of hundred studies almost of studies that had looked at this notion of recovery and the active ingredients. And when she boiled it all down across these 150 studies or thereabouts, what she found was there were 5 major pieces of active ingredients that people reported on average. One was community, the sense of community, camaraderie, a new community of usually peers, other people who've had the disorder but are now living in recovery, that sense of community. Hope and optimism that people could get well, that's number 2. Hope and optimism that they felt that they could get well and stay well. A positive identity was another active ingredient, people feeling good about themselves now that they were living in recovery. Meaning and purpose was another active ingredient, and empowerment, the sense of feeling empowered, or that sense of self-efficacy and confidence that you feel as a person in recovery or come to feel. And that spelt this nice acronym, CHIME, C-H-I-M-E. That's an easy way to remember it. C for community, H for hope and optimism, I for identity, M for meaning and purpose, E for empowerment. So that's one model. Again, that is appealing to many people in recovery because it really resonates with people's own lived experience about what recovery means to them. And of course, there are other things, kind of related to that or even subsumed under that things I mentioned, like a sense of positive self-esteem, feeling increased self-worth, and confidence, coping skills, emotion regulation. People are better able to regulate emotion, without resorting to use of a substance. All of these things are part and parcel of recovery. So it's generally again summed up in improved, and sometimes dramatically improved quality of life and functioning, and an intensified life, a kind of technicolor version of life where people feel better than well. It's been described as not just well, but actually better than well. I'm really not just surviving here, but I'm actually thriving and flourishing.
So beautiful. And I think that, for any of us who have struggled with addiction, the everyday becomes more magical when, again, like if you've had a cancer or anything that you've seriously threatened your life, that you can, start to just appreciate the everyday in such a much more powerful way. I'm curious if you could speak to the meaning and purpose aspect of that, because I do know it's a huge piece of recovery for almost most of the clients that we work with. How do I find my meaning or purpose? I know that for a lot of people, especially parents, they may be raising their kids and then their kids go off to school and now they've lost that meaning and purpose. And maybe that's when substance use disorder starts to take place in their life, or even for individuals, I know that starting their stats seem to be going up for people in retirement homes, or, kind of who have now living this life where they're not independent anymore. Meaning and purpose is removed. So can you speak to the meaning and purpose of that study?
Yeah, I think it's about finding your own expression, your own unique expression of who you are, unencumbered by the disease of addiction. And there are many different ways that people do that. And, it could be something that people cannot see right away. Maybe it's a new career. Maybe it's an element of their lifestyle. It could be a new element of spirituality that people seek out and find meaning in a path there. It could be a new activity or hobby that gives people a new sense of purpose and meaning. It can be giving back to help other people. This is a very common way that people do in the addiction field, because they feel kind of liberated and have received a new kind of grace that they want to use to help other people. And so that gives them a lot of sense of meaning and purpose in being able to help others. From their own major disasters, it becomes an asset. It becomes an asset that they can use to inspire other people, because they are a living example, of course. When people get into recovery, they're a vivid, living, tangible example of what's possible. And that can be a very powerful way that people can derive meaning, a new sense of meaning and purpose in big and small ways. So the myriad ways that people find to derive meaning and purpose. And I think people who have suffered greatly because of addiction, it's a little easier. I think people struggle with this universally, of course, across the human race. But I think because of that powerful suffering that people have gone to, that in and of itself, getting into remission recovery provides a sense of meaning and purpose, that they've there's some reason for their survival. There's some reason for them getting, and that can lead to all kinds of good things and good pathways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Can you speak to us about change a little? I know we talked about the active ingredients, but when we look at all these many pathways of recovery, what are the mechanisms by which people change and then are able to maintain that change?
Yeah, you can think about it in terms of behavior change. Back in the 1980s, there was studies being done by two researchers, Carlo Di Clemente and James Prochaska, and they developed what became known as the stages of change. And what they delineated, and they derived this from studies of smoking cessation, actually, where they had large numbers of people, and they looked at all the studies. I think there was about 900 studies where they looked at how people change their smoking behavior in this sense. And then they derived these 6 different phases or stages, which are useful to understand behavior change. One of them was pre-contemplation, another one was contemplation, another one was decision or determination, another one was action, another one was maintenance, and then they had a sixth one, which was relapse. So sometimes people would get into this and then relapse and cycle back around. So this was the idea that they noticed, because as we've just talked about earlier, it takes sometimes a number of attempts before people are able to finally really get a good handle on what they need to do one day at a time to stay in remission. And so what they noticed was these stages that people went to, and I can just explain those stages a little bit more, which is pre-contemplation is when you may not actually know that you have a problem. Other people may see it. Other people may point it out to you, but you're kind of in the dark yourself. Sometimes they say, the addicted person is kind of the last one to find out, because everyone else can see it around them, but sometimes they're the last to say, aha, okay, I see now. Yes, I have a problem. So that recognition is contemplation. That's the next stage. Okay, yeah, I get it. I see I have a problem here. I need to do something about it. Then that next stage is the decision stage, the third stage, which is what they call determination or decision. It's called a couple of different names. But it's the sense of, okay, yeah, I can see I've got a problem and I'm making a decision to do something about it. And then the action stage is the fourth stage, which is I am doing something about it. I'm getting treatment, I'm getting help, I'm doing whatever I need to do to move along the pathway in an active way. And then the maintenance phase is kind of continuing to do that. And then, of course, relapse can happen, which is the sixth phase. Eventually, people will go around that cycle, as it were. They may skip the first contemplation, obviously, but get back into the action phase pretty quickly again if they do relapse and have a reinstatement of the disorder. They're able to get back and to say, okay, I know what I need to do. This time I'm going to amplify, or I'm going to intensify my efforts in these areas. I recognize where things I need to avoid. And then eventually they will get in and stay in that maintenance phase. So there is that kind of model of behavior change, which is, I think, still very useful, and onto which we've mapped a number of different interventions that kind of map onto. For example, when people are pre-contemplative, they don't see a problem, they can still cause harm to themselves and others. So we use harm reduction strategies to help them at that point. With things like contemplation and the decision stages, those stages 2 and 3, we can use motivational enhancement or motivational interviewing to help people resolve ambivalence about change. And relapse prevention, cognitive behavioral strategies, and other mutual help 12-step facilitation strategies and other long-term maintenance strategies that can help people sustain change over time. So we've been able to map onto these different stages, different interventions, which have been very helpful. So that's been a really useful model that, courtesy of Carlo Di Clemente and James Projaska, has given us, which is still very useful.
I love it because I can help, individuals or clients identify that just thinking about, making a change is a stage of change. And when we start that, putting things in place, that preparation, decision making, that's a stage of change.
Yeah.
And, that it does take time to get through all of those stages. But when you see, you're like, oh, I'm already at 3 out of 6, or I mean, we hope to not always go to 6, but it could happen. And that you can flow back and forth between that model. I think it really does provide people with even hope to know that, like, well, I've already done 2 stages just by thinking about reaching out, maybe having a consult with somebody and actively seeking what are some options for treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right. I like that because it's pointing out, because they may feel like they're not making much progress, but as you pointed out, is to acknowledge, what you actually are. You've actually recognized that you do have something to address here, or something that you want to consider addressing, and that is actually progress. So I think anytime we can recognize, acknowledge that, point it out, amplify it, can instill hope and help motivate people to move forwards towards more healthful behavior change. I agree.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could speak to our listeners about recovery capital. What is it? Why should they be aware of it? We obviously go through this with our Sweet Sobriety members, and there is a very helpful kind of checklist that you can go through. But for our listeners who've never heard about it, could you share a little bit about what it is?
Yeah. Well, you can think of, recovery capital is kind of the latest buzzword, if you will, in terms of how we think about resources or resources that you can draw on to help you in your recovery. It comes from behavioral economics, so it's an economic term, right? Capital, you think about capital, you think about money, some kind of, and it is a kind of like that in the same way as that we kind of, people can draw on their kind of recovery bank account, if you will. What's in the bank account that you can draw on? I'm not talking just financially, although finances can be important. Some money can be important, of course, to live your life and move forwards. But when we talk about recovery capital, we're really talking about the total sum of accessible, available resources that can be drawn upon to help people get traction and move forwards in their recovery attempt. This could be internal, it could be physical health. Are you impaired physically? What about mental health? Do you have motivation? Do you have coping? Do you feel that your confidence to move forwards? The external factors, do you have support? Do you have social capital? The supports in your environment that you can interact with to inspire you, to instill hope, to shed that sense of stigma and shame that can come from associating with other people who have the disorder or are in recovery. It could be jobs, housing, finances, education. These are the kind of external pieces of recovery capital that people can gain access to that can help them move forwards. And all of these things, of course, are critical to building optimism and hope that people can gain access to these kind of building materials, if you will, and scaffolding that they need to rebuild their lives and move forwards. So this is what we try and do in treatment, of course, and in the provision of recovery support services in terms of recovery housing, recovery community centers, recovery coaching, peers with lived experience, recovery educational workplaces, recovery supports and work. All these things are designed to help provide that recovery capital and build optimism and hope.
One of the things I love the most about your website is the dictionary. And I just think it's so important because the language we use matters when speaking about substance use disorders. So, can you tell us a little bit about what was the motivation behind creating it and why the language we use around substance use disorder is so important?
I think there's two things. One is precision, the other is stigma. So, there's a lot of terminology when we talk about addiction. And addiction is, when I use the term addiction right there, I'm not just talking about the severe end of the spectrum, even though technically addiction really means the impaired control over the ability to regulate the impulse to use despite harmful consequences. That's what addiction is. But not everybody has that impaired control at the lower end of the substance use disorder spectrum. So there's a precision aspect to our language, isn't there, and how we communicate clinically and in public health communications. This is important so that as professionals, we all understand each other. Are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about the same clinical subgroup or the same clinical population, or are we talking about different subgroups? I felt that was important to address. So the precisional aspect of our communication in our field is important. The other thing which you alluded to, which is perhaps a bigger ticket item, which is the stigma and discrimination, which goes along hand in hand with these disorders. And so, many years ago, I felt like there was a lot of language in our field which was very stigmatizing or potentially stigmatizing. And so I was able to do a few studies now to actually look at that empirically and understand, yes, there is actually language that can induce implicit bias in people. And so it's become very important for us to really look at the kind of language that we use to describe the disorder as well as people who suffer from it, because it does seem to make a difference in terms of people's judgments. This can be at the individual level, can be at the policy level in terms of where we appropriate funding for addressing these disorders. Do we provide more police and more prisons, or do we provide more prevention, treatment, and recovery support services, depending on how we want to address it? The classic example I often give is, we always refer to people with eating related problems as having an eating disorder, never as food abusers. And yet, for some reason, we always talk about substance abusers or drug abusers, not people with substance use disorders, or at least historically that was the case. Now that's changed. Now it's still a long way to go, but that language has shifted because of what we know now about certain terms, particularly the abuse term. Calling someone a drug abuser implies this kind of willful misconduct, intentional willful misconduct at the expense of other people. And so we've dropped that because of that connotation and adopted the new substance use disorder language. So there's been progress, but still a long way to go in terms of our choice of words in our language. The dictionary, I constructed that and put it on the website because I wanted to create a language that is unified and that we all know and can agree on what these terms mean or should mean, and we can hopefully abide by them and reduce stigma.
I'm wondering if in that, creating that a dictionary, if there has been anything that has another term that has come up rather than abstinence. For some people, it still seems to carry this like stigma of itself, maybe like historically. And if there, of a better term to use instead of it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know some people find, strangely in some ways, isn't it? It's kind of odd that people, who struggle so hard to stop, have expended enormous energy and the heartache to finally achieve abstinence. Now you can't use that term because it seems in some quarters, and not for everybody, of course, but I think. You could talk about the phrase comes to mind is non-use. I don't use anymore. Just get around that term abstinence if it's objectionable to some people. We do know, of course, you've got this term of being in remission is another term that people often use. Now, you can have abstinent remission and non-abstinent remission. But the more the point is that someone who's in remission obviously is asymptomatic. They don't have symptoms of the disease or the disorder, someone who's in remission. But it's not just about remission, because don't forget, you can still cause health harms even without being symptomatic. A classic case would be alcohol, for example. So you could be functioning fine. You could be functioning very well, but drinking heavily. So what that means is that you can still incur liver disease and increase your risk of cancer from alcohol, even though you're in remission from alcohol use disorder. So it's not just about low-level use or being in remission, but you have to have levels which are associated with non-health harms as well.
Yeah, even I find the term reoccurrence is seems much more loving than relapse. In many ways, I think our community at least finds it, especially with food, as it is maybe even more challenging than some of the other substance use disorders that individuals struggle with, just because food is so ubiquitous in our lives. It's all the time. And so I think reoccurrence just feels like, oh, it's back again, rather than relapse, which seems to be like back to day one or the beginning. And this may be because of the 12-step, process that, which is still a really good peer community support group. But I think that the idea of relapse, I think even the word relapse is back to beginning is what it is defined as. So I think reoccurrence just seems like, at least I have heard from clients that it's much more approachable in terms of recovery for them.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Yeah, I think, again, we need to obviously, and you're raising another question, which is, which someone brought to me. I was up in Montreal last week and speaking on this topic at a conference up there, and someone who'd done some research asking patients what they prefer. It's very interesting, because as kind of public health clinicians, as it were, with that hat on, we might have a different viewpoint than what patients. So he'd done some work on what patients preferred to be called, and it wasn't always the same as what we would think as clinicians or professionals working in the field would think that they would prefer. So that's interesting too, to get these different viewpoints. And it's hard to reach complete consensus on these things because there's lots of opinions and different sensitivities around certain language. But I think if we can reach consensus, that's wonderful across the board for the professional and very importantly the patient level. And if we've got some data, some empirical experimental data to back it up, even better, because then we know that this is not just about our own sensitivities, but rather it actually does induce these biases. What we found, for example, in the initial study we did back in 2010, was that even among expert clinicians, they were susceptible to bias, induced bias, by using that abuse term when we randomized it between calling someone a substance abuser versus having a substance use disorder. These were doctoral level clinicians who were still susceptible to that bias, more punitive bias, when exactly the same person was described as a substance abuser as opposed to having a substance use disorder. So that's very interesting. So if we can couple our own thoughts with empirical data, all to the better, because we've got more gusto, then more reason to change our language.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I do think it's also personally, professionally okay for anyone to name themselves whatever helps them. Some people, in recovery just like to say, I'm an alcoholic, and that is very shifting for them. That's just something that is very empowering. And so it's at a very individual level, but I do agree that professionally we should, be using the appropriate language when it comes to the individuals that we are working with. I am wondering if you have seen a shift in the research around stigma with addiction over time. I mean, I certainly can remember in my own personal recovery from alcohol use disorder. That would have been, I was probably around 25. So 20 years ago, my psychiatrist was like, oh, you have bipolar. And I was like, yes, I don't have addiction. It was that much stigma that I would have been willing to be diagnosed with anything other than addiction at that time. Now I feel like it's improved, but I mean, I'm immersed in the field all of the time and I recover out loud. But what does the research say about stigma and addiction?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. And I think that's still true. Unfortunately. And again, I don't know if we'll ever entirely destigmatize, but we can certainly make inroads and make progress here. I still think that when it comes to psychiatric illnesses, substance use disorder is the most stigmatized. And this has been borne out internationally as well in studies that have been done around the world across different societies. Universally, people view people who have these problems, alcohol or drug problems, as being, as being more to blame for having them, because they see them, you have to take something outside of yourself into yourself. So it's not like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, which is inside the brain. Arguably you didn't do anything to cause it, whereas people view people with these substance use disorders as kind of bringing it on themselves. And I think that's always going to be the case in terms of the stigma. Now, of course, having said that, what we have learned in the last 50 years is, just like other complex illnesses, people don't choose to be addicted. People are not choosing. They never dreamt of what could happen to them. Just like everybody else, they may have been exposed to alcohol or another drug at a youngish age. And there's something about the genetic modulation, which now we understand to explain about half the risk for addiction. So it's a very important component, just like all complex illnesses. There's a genetic component. And people who have this susceptibility, they don't know they have that susceptibility. And so just like everybody else, they may try it, but they experience a much deeper, more profound rewarding effect or relieving effect. And so it's very different, the response that those individuals have from initial exposure. One of my colleagues, Rob West, he always says, if drugs are so pleasurable, how come we're not all addicted? How come 90% of the population is exposed to alcohol, which is an addictive drug, but only about 15% become addicted? Same with opioids. Why is it that only a certain proportion? It's because of this genetic modulation, which influences this initial response. And some of us are protected, some of us are more vulnerable. And so, like other complex illnesses, doesn't explain the whole thing. It's not genetically determined, but it's genetically influenced. These facts, these scientific facts from the last 50 years of clinical research in these areas has really helped to reduce that blame. But it's still there, Clarissa, isn't it? It's still there. There's still elements there, in part because of the negative externalities that go along with substance use. When people are intoxicated, for example, it can become ugly. It can create, obviously it can affect other people. And of course, these are real things. One of the things that we try and address, of course, is when people are in recovery, is to try and dismantle the stigma and discrimination that occurs when people are in recovery or trying to get in recovery, because that can really take the wind out of people's sails if they feel that they're being discriminated against or being stigmatized. So we've got a long way to go, but we've made progress.
I love that you speak to that genetic piece too. I mean, I can certainly relate. Having been in a car accident, I was put on some prescription painkillers, and they really made me feel like I'm alive, and I had so much energy, and I could figure things out and just go, go, go. And then, a friend of mine was taking a similar medication, and she would just fall asleep. And, she didn't like the way that it made her feel. And I think for so many of our listeners, we do have that already genetic predisposition towards, whether it's food and the food we get exposed to, ultra processed foods at such a young age. And I really think that can have an impact on the trajectory of what our, substance use disorder can look like. Absolutely. I'm wondering, when we're thinking about the average person and stigma, so maybe I'm somebody in recovery, or maybe I'm somebody who has a family member who struggles with substance use, what can I do to help reduce stigma?
Well, I think there's a few things that one can do. The things that we know make a difference are when people understand more about the true nature of these disorders, stigma tends to decrease. When we use certain terminology, when we describe someone not as a drug abuser or an alcohol abuser, but rather as someone who has a substance use disorder, a history of substance use disorder, or a heroin use disorder, or a cocaine use disorder, or alcohol use disorder, whatever the type of disorder is, to talk about it in non-stigmatizing ways, in more medical public health terminology, as a testament to its true medical nature, of course. The other way is through what people talk about as social exposure or social contact interventions. In other words, when people are out, as it were, when they're talking about the fact that they are a person in recovery, as you do, Clarissa, you recover out loud, that again helps to dismantle stereotypes that people have. And this has been a big thrust of the recovery movement in the last 25 years, has been putting a face and a voice on recovery. So the idea here is exactly that, is that it's hard to hold prejudices when you're standing face to face, or somebody, or work with somebody, or have a family member who is in recovery. Then those stereotypes tend to get dismantled. Now, the danger here, of course, is the exception. Clarissa's an exception. She's a good one. Clarissa's a good one. She's an exception to the rule of all the bad people. And this is why it's important for more people to speak out, for more people to actually say, no, wait a minute, it's not just Clarissa. It's all us over here. There's 23 million people who are in recovery in the United States, roughly 10% of the adult population. Those individuals are starting to speak out too and say, you know what, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and this is what I'm doing, and I'm living a life in recovery, and you would never know it because I don't look like what happened to me. I look much better than that, and I am functioning and doing well and contributing and paying taxes and doing all the things that regular people do, and then some a lot of the time. So again, that social exposure. Now, not everybody chooses to do that, of course. That's up to them, how they live their recovery, whether they want to disclose it or not, or when to disclose it and to whom. That can vary also. But that's another way that can be helpful to dismantle these stereotypes and prejudices and stigma and discrimination.
Awesome. I'm wondering, like, what is it about your work that makes you the most excited? Like, if somebody puts a proposal for a research study or something that comes across your desk, what are you like, yes, I'm really interested in this?
Good question. You know, there's so many things. I think it's kind of discovery of new things, of how we can help more people more quickly. You know, I'm particularly interested in addressing these disorders and diseases earlier, as you alluded to earlier, about, you know, we know that, you know, 90% of adult cases of substance use disorder started before the age of 18, 50% before the age of 15. So how can we head them off sooner, get people into remission sooner rather than later, when there's been so many milestones missed and unnecessary deaths have occurred? So that's something that excites me, that we can create, you know, more intensified focus on prevention, treatment, and recovery for those adolescents, late adolescents, and emerging adults. We need to be much more innovative. So things that innovative models of care that can attract and engage younger people sooner into recovery excite me. But I think in general, you know, anything that it's kind of a gap in the field that we think that we know needs to be filled, and you can spot it and you say, you know what, we need to go there, we need to be in that space, we need to discover there. That excites me, you know, because obviously it's a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to solve, and then we need to get in and roll up our sleeves and find out more to help more people and help them sooner to achieve remission and stable remission. So those are the kind of things that kind of get me excited.
Thinking about that, I mean, there's a lot of buzz about psychedelics and addiction treatment. Is the Recovery Research Institute looking at that right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We look at the literature. We're not doing studies ourselves directly on psychedelics or testing psychedelics ourselves, but we are very aware on the literature, on the studies that are being done around the world on psychedelics and their potential utility from a clinical public health standpoint. So, of course, you know, it's very important that we remain open to any kind of therapeutic that could be helpful to help people get into remission. And there is, of course, a natural kind of knee-jerk reaction, which wait a minute, you can't give people psychedelics, you can't give people, you know, magic mushrooms, psilocybin or LSD, you know, because those things can cause problems themselves. Yes, but at the same time, when you know, heroin is an anesthetic, is a painkiller. Excuse me, a very important painkiller. Diacetylmorphine is critically helpful when you're in the hospital to manage pain. Same as fentanyl, but of course it can be misused, like any drug or drugs that can cause pleasure or reduce pain. They can be misused. So, but it's important to recognize the therapeutic potential. We need to be open-minded. Use the experimental method to test out these things before we pass judgment. Sometimes the field can get too carried away with these things, that the enthusiasm precedes the science, only for the enthusiasm to be dramatically dampened later. So we want to be cautiously optimistic, test these things out with psychedelics or other things to help people. But it's important we're open-minded and try these things. If they don't work out, then we've tried it with an open mind, with a scientific method. If they do, then hooray. Now, if we can get 5 more people into remission, 5% more people into remission, or 10% more people into remission via a certain strategy or therapeutic, then that's a win for them, for their families and society.
Oh, thank you so much for being here today, John. I've appreciated this conversation so much with you, and I know our audience will too.
My pleasure, Clarissa. Thanks for having me. Good talking to you.
Good talking to you too. Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group. I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.